In 1978, a Jewish photographer from Los Angeles spent 5 days locked inside a cathedral in Turin, Italy, photographing a piece of cloth that scientists could not explain then, and still cannot fully explain today. He went in expecting to document the unmasking of a medieval fraud. He left with photographs of something that, 40 years later, a new scientific dating method would suggest is far older than anyone in that room believed possible. His name was Barrie Schwortz, and this is the story of what he found, why it changed his life, and why the mystery he spent nearly 5 decades investigating is still not solved. Barrie Schwortz was born in Los Angeles in 1946, raised in an Orthodox Jewish household, with no particular interest in Christian relics or religious controversies. What he cared about was photography. He trained at the Brooks Institute of Photography and built a career as a technical and commercial photographer, the kind of specialist hired for jobs that demanded scientific precision as much as artistic skill. So when he was approached in 1977 and asked whether he would join a team of American scientists planning to examine the Shroud of Turin, his first instinct was doubt, not devotion. He assumed it was almost certainly a painted fake, a medieval tourist relic dressed up in religious mystique. But the assignment itself, documenting a serious scientific investigation of one of the most famous and controversial objects in the world, was too interesting to turn down. He signed on as the official documenting photographer for what would become known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP. The team that assembled in October of 1978 was unlike anything that had examined the shroud before or has examined it since. More than 30 scientists, including physicists, chemists, and forensic specialists, some from Los Alamos National Laboratory, some from universities across the United States, were given round-the-clock access to the cloth for 5 straight days and nights inside the Royal Palace in Turin. Schwortz later described the setting as nothing like a modern laboratory. It was a 400-year-old building with creaking floors, dusty tapestries, and frescoed ceilings that visibly shook every time a truck rolled past outside. Into that unlikely setting, the team brought some of the most advanced imaging and analytical equipment available at the time. And for 5 days, Schwortz photographed every test, every sample site, and every stage of the investigation, building the only complete photographic record that exists of that examination. What the team found did not fit the assumption most of them walked in with. The image on the cloth, a faint, straw-colored figure showing the front and back of a man's body, as though the fabric had been laid over a corpse, showed no evidence of brushstrokes, no pigment buildup, and no layering of any kind under magnification. Whatever had created the image had not been painted or applied to the surface in any conventional sense. Instead, the discoloration appeared to affect only the very outermost layer of the linen fibers themselves, a depth of a few hundred nanometers, with no penetration into the threads below and no image at all on the reverse side of the cloth. No known dye, stain, or pigment behaves this way. Paint and dye soak into fabric fibers through capillary action. This image sat on the surface alone, as though something had altered the chemistry of the topmost fibers without ever touching the ones beneath them. Then there was the negative property, something that unsettled even the scientists who considered themselves hardened skeptics. When Schwortz developed his photographic negatives of the shroud in the darkroom, the image reversed from a vague, almost featureless smudge into a strikingly detailed, 3-dimensional looking face and body. In other words, the image on the cloth itself behaves like a photographic negative, something that only becomes clearly legible when reversed through photographic or digital processing. Photography, as a technology, did not exist until the 1820s. If the cloth was a deliberate medieval creation, as the later carbon dating would suggest, someone in the 12 or 1300s would have had to design an image meant to be viewed through a technology that would not be invented for another 500 years, and to do so with no apparent means of even testing whether their work would translate correctly once photographed. Perhaps the most striking finding came from analysis of the image's encoded depth information. In 1976, well before the STURP examination, researchers used a device called a VP8 image analyzer, originally developed for NASA to translate variations in image brightness into 3-dimensional topography, and ran it against a photograph of the shroud. The result was a coherent 3-dimensional relief of a human body, as though the intensity of the image at any given point corresponded directly to the distance between the cloth and the body it had covered. Schwortz and the Stirp team observed the same effect during their own examination in 1978. Areas of the image closest to where a body would have touched the cloth, like the bridge of the nose or the tops of the cheekbones, appeared darker, while areas farther away, like the sides of the face, appeared lighter. Ordinary paintings do not behave this way. When you run a photograph of a painted portrait through the same three-dimensional analysis, the result is meaningless distortion, because a painter renders light and shadow the way the eye perceives them, not as literal, measurable distances between a canvas and a body. The Shroud's image, by contrast, held genuine spatial information, as though whatever produced it responded to physical proximity rather than to any artist's visual judgment. Stirp's final statement, published after the investigation, was carefully worded and deliberately cautious. The team concluded that the image was that of a real scourged and crucified human form, and that it was not the product of an artist, while stopping well short of declaring the cloth authentic or explaining how the image had actually formed. That unresolved question, how, is what kept Schwortz tied to the Shroud for the rest of his life. He had gone to Turin as a 5-day assignment. It became a nearly 50-year commitment. A decade later, in 1988, the Vatican authorized a new phase of testing, radiocarbon dating, performed independently by 3 respected laboratories at Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. All 3 labs returned strikingly consistent results, dating the linen to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD, placing its origin firmly in the medieval period, and for many people, settling the question of authenticity once and for all. For Schwortz and his former Stirp colleagues, the announcement landed hard. It seemed to directly contradict everything the 1978 investigation had documented about the image's unexplained properties. But as researchers, including Schwortz, scrutinized the dating process in the years that followed, real methodological concerns emerged, concerns that remain part of the scientific conversation today. The sample used for carbon dating came from a single corner of the cloth, a section that had been handled the most over the centuries, sat near the site of a documented fire in 1532 that scorched and damaged the fabric, and showed signs consistent with historical repair or reweaving. Critics, including chemist Raymond Rogers, a fellow Stirp member, later argued that this specific corner may not have been representative of the cloth as a whole, and that any repair threads or surface contamination could have skewed a radiocarbon result without affecting the rest of the linen. This is not a fringe objection. It has been debated in peer-reviewed literature for decades, and it remains one of the central open questions in Shroud research. Does the 1988 date reflect the age of a whole cloth, or only the age and condition of one small, heavily handled corner of it? That question took on new weight in 2022, when a research team led by Italian crystallographer Liberato De Caro published a study using a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WXS, a non-destructive method that measures the natural, slow structural degradation of cellulose fibers in linen over time. Unlike radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of a radioactive isotope, this method tracks physical changes in the fabric's molecular structure that accumulate steadily as flax fibers age. The team tested the technique against several linen samples of known well-documented age, including a fragment from the Siege of Masada in Israel, dated with confidence to between 55 and 74 AD, and compared those results against a thread taken from the Shroud near the same corner used in the 1988 test. The scattering pattern from the Shroud's linen matched most closely with the 1st century Masada sample, not with any medieval textile in their comparison set. The researchers were careful to describe their findings as an early, experimental result requiring further validation across more samples, and other scientists have since raised their own questions about the technique's reliability. It has not overturned the 1988 dating in the eyes of the broader scientific community, and it should not be presented as definitive proof of anything. But it is a real, peer-reviewed, published study, and it means the age of the Shroud is, today, a genuinely unresolved scientific question, not a settled one. For Schwortz, none of this was ever really about proving a religious claim. Anyone who followed his decades of work noticed the same pattern. He consistently drew a line between the data and the conclusions people wanted to draw from it. He founded Shroud.com in the mid-1990s, turning it into the largest and most comprehensive archive of Shroud research on the Internet, and later established the nonprofit Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association to preserve his photographic collection and the scientific materials gathered by Stirp, including samples donated by Raymond Rogers' widow after his death. Schwortz gave lectures around the world, appeared in documentaries on major networks, and spent nearly 50 years fielding the same two questions from strangers. Do you believe it's real? And do you think it wrapped Jesus? His answer consistently was that he approached the shroud as a question of evidence rather than belief, that the image's physical properties did not match any known artistic technique from any era, that the 1988 dating rested on a sample with real, documented problems, and that decades of study by serious scientists had still not produced an agreed explanation for how the image was formed. He was careful never to call that proof of anything supernatural. He called it simply unexplained. Barrie Schwortz passed away in June of 2024 at the age of 77, having spent close to half a century as the closest living witness to the only unrestricted scientific examination the Shroud of Turin has ever undergone. He never set out to become one of the world's leading voices on a Christian relic. He was a Jewish commercial photographer who took a 5-day assignment and ended up spending the rest of his life trying to understand what he had actually photographed. What he left behind is not a final answer. It's a body of documented physical evidence, an image with no pigment and no brushstrokes, a negative property that predates the invention of photography by half a millennium, three-dimensional depth information no painting has ever replicated, and a dating debate that a real 2022 scientific study reopened rather than closed. Whatever the Shroud of Turin actually is, the honest answer, the one Schwortz himself spent his life giving, is still that we don't fully know. And after nearly 50 years of some of the most intensive scientific scrutiny ever applied to a single object, that in itself says something remarkable about how strange this piece of linen really is.